Oh, wow. They're really letting anyone wear a badge now. The voice cut through the room before anyone even looked up. Officer Reynolds leaned back in his chair, boots propped lazily on the desk, eyes dragging slowly over the young black woman standing near the entrance. He let out a short, dry laugh loud enough for everyone to hear. "Tell me that's not real," he added, nodding toward the badge clipped to her uniform. Before she could respond, Officer Parker stepped in, too close, too fast, reaching out and flicking the badge with 2 fingers like it was a cheap prop. "Feels light," he said, smirking. Then, without asking, he unclipped it completely. A couple of officers chuckled. One of them pulled out a phone. "Yo, don't move," someone muttered. "This is funny." Reynolds stood now, circling her, slowly shaking his head. "Let me guess, first day, or did you just get lost on the way to admin?" More laughter. Louder this time. More people watching. She didn't move, didn't speak. Just looked at them, calm, steady, unreadable. And then her phone vibrated. If they had paid attention, they might have stopped right there. The Baltimore Central Precinct woke up the same way it always did, loud, restless, and just a little too comfortable with itself. By 7:45 a.m., the bullpen was already alive with the low hum of overlapping conversations, the clatter of keyboards, and the occasional burst of laughter that traveled farther than it should have. Coffee cups sat half-finished on cluttered desks. Case files were stacked in uneven piles. A TV mounted in the corner played muted morning news while captions scrolled across the screen. Nothing about the place suggested change, and yet change had already arrived. Officer Aaliyah Carter stepped through the front doors without announcement. She didn't pause to take in the room. Didn't look around for approval or acknowledgement. Her pace was steady, measured, deliberate, each step quiet against the polished floor. She wore a standard patrol uniform, pressed but unremarkable. No extra insignia, no visible sign of rank beyond what should have been enough. Her badge. Simple. Clean. Official. But in a room like this, recognition didn't come from metal. It came from assumptions. Aaliyah moved toward the central desk, her expression calm, her posture straight, but relaxed. Her eyes passed briefly over the officers already gathered. Reynolds leaning back in his chair with casual authority, Parker standing beside him with that same restless energy, and Diaz a few feet away, watching more than participating. They had already noticed her, not with curiosity, with judgment. Reynolds was the first to speak, though not directly to her. "New rotation didn't say anything about transfers this week," he muttered loud enough for Parker to hear, and for her to catch every word. Parker followed his gaze, then let out a short breath that almost resembled a laugh. "Yeah," he said, tilting his head slightly. "Pretty sure we'd remember that." Neither of them greeted her. Neither of them asked her name. They didn't need to. In their minds, they had already decided who she was. Aaliyah stopped at the edge of the desk, placing a thin folder down with quiet precision. The sound barely registered in the noise of the room, but it marked her presence in a way that couldn't be ignored. Still, no one addressed her. A few officers nearby exchanged glances. One leaned closer to another, whispering just low enough to pretend it wasn't meant to be heard. "Probably admin support," he said. "They've been sending more of them lately." "Yeah," the other replied, eyes flicking briefly toward Aaliyah before looking away. "Wouldn't be the first time they dropped someone in without telling us." Aaliyah heard it. All of it. She didn't respond. Didn't correct them. Instead, she reached into her pocket and checked the time, 7:47 a.m. 2 minutes passed. Then 3. The room continued exactly as it had before she entered, as if her presence had been absorbed into the background, filed away under not important, until Reynolds decided otherwise. He swung his feet down from the desk and stood up slowly, stretching his shoulders like a man preparing for something mildly entertaining. "Hey," he called out. Not sharp, not aggressive, just casual enough to carry authority without effort. The room quieted slightly. Not because of her, because of him. Reynolds took a few steps forward, stopping just short of where Aaliyah stood. His eyes moved over her again, slower this time, more deliberate. "You looking for someone?" he asked. The question sounded neutral. It wasn't. Aaliyah met his gaze. "For now," she said calmly, "I'm exactly where I need to be." There was a pause. Short, noticeable. Then Parker let out a quiet laugh under his breath. "Yeah," he said, folding his arms. "That's usually what people say when they're in the wrong place." A few heads turned. The tone shifted not dramatically, but enough. Enough for attention to start gathering. Reynolds didn't look away from her. "Let's try this again," he said, his voice just a little firmer now. "Who are you here to see?" Aaliyah didn't hesitate. "No one," she replied. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind that stretched just enough to make people uncomfortable. Diaz shifted slightly where he stood, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in hostility but in something closer to curiosity. Something didn't fit. But Reynolds wasn't interested in that. He stepped a little closer, closing the space between them in a way that wasn't overtly aggressive, but wasn't respectful either. "You don't just walk into this floor and stand around," he said. "We've got protocols." Aaliyah nodded once. "I'm aware." Her tone didn't rise, didn't challenge, but it didn't submit either, and that, more than anything, irritated him. Parker pushed off the desk and moved to stand beside Reynolds, now his presence reinforcing the imbalance. "Look," Parker said, glancing briefly at the folder she had placed down. "If you're dropping off paperwork, there's a desk downstairs for that." He tapped the edge of the folder with one finger, light, dismissive. "They'll take care of it." Aaliyah didn't move to retrieve it. "That won't be necessary," she said. Reynolds exhaled slowly through his nose, the faintest hint of a smile returning. "Right," he said, "because you've got it handled." A couple of officers nearby chuckled, not loudly, but enough. The atmosphere shifted again, subtle but building. Assumptions turning into confidence, confidence turning into behavior, and behavior, left unchecked, always escalated. Aaliyah glanced once more at the clock on the wall. 7:52 a.m. 5 minutes. Still no announcement. Still no interruption. Still no reason for them to reconsider. She folded her hands loosely in front of her. Her posture unchanged, her expression unreadable. Waiting. Watching. Measuring. Across the room, one of the younger officers leaned toward another. "Is it just me?" he whispered. "Or is she not reacting at all?" The other shrugged. Probably knows she's out of place. But Diaz didn't look convinced. His eyes stayed on Aaliyah, his brow tightening just slightly. Because there was something about the way she stood there. Not defensive, not uncertain, not lost, composed, intentional. Like someone who wasn't waiting for permission, but for timing. Reynolds, however, had already made up his mind. And in a room that followed his lead, that was enough. "So here's what's going to happen," he said, straightening his posture, his voice carrying just enough to draw wider attention. "You're either going to tell us who you're supposed to report to," he let the sentence hang for a moment, "or we're going to help you find your way back out." The room didn't go silent, but it leaned in, just slightly, enough to feel it. Aaliyah looked at him, then at Parker, then briefly around the room, taking in every face, every expression, every assumption. And then she spoke, quietly, clearly. "I'd suggest you wait." Reynolds's smile didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. "Yeah," he said. And why's that? Aaliyah held his gaze. "Because in a few minutes, she said, this conversation is going to matter a lot more than you think." Another pause. Another shift. Small. Almost invisible. But real. Reynolds tilted his head slightly, studying her, now not with doubt, but with interest. The kind that came right before someone decided to push further. "Is that a warning?" he asked. Aaliyah didn't answer. She didn't need to. And that silence only made things worse. Across the room, someone quietly hit record on their phone. Because whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not even close. The shift from curiosity to open disrespect didn't happen all at once. It never did. It crept in quiet at first, almost deniable, before settling into something heavier, something harder to ignore. By 7:55 a.m., the bullpen no longer saw Aaliyah Carter as an unknown. They saw her as someone out of place, and that in their eyes was enough. Reynolds glanced toward Parker, then back at Aaliyah, the faint smirk still sitting comfortably on his face. "You know what he said," clapping his hands together once the sharp sound cutting through the room. "We're gonna make this simple." He stepped past her, not away, but around, circling just enough to shift the dynamic. "You don't belong on this floor," he added. "That's not a guess. That's experience." A couple of officers nearby nodded. Agreement didn't need to be spoken. It was understood. Parker leaned forward slightly, resting one hand on the edge of the desk, the other gesturing lazily toward Aaliyah's uniform. "Uniform looks right," he said, almost thoughtfully. "Badge, too." He paused. Then his tone changed just enough to sharpen the edge. "But that doesn't mean much these days." A low ripple of laughter followed. Not loud, not explosive, but steady, comfortable. The kind that came from repetition. Not surprise. Aaliyah didn't react, didn't shift her weight, didn't defend herself. Her silence at this point had become its own presence, one that made some people uneasy, and others more aggressive. Reynolds noticed. Of course he did. And instead of stepping back, he stepped in. "Let's see that again," he said, reaching out, not asking, his fingers brushing against the edge of her badge where it rested on her chest. For a fraction of a second, the contact lingered. Not accidental, not respectful. A test. Then, without hesitation, he unclipped it. Clean, effortless, deliberate. The small metallic click echoed louder than it should have. A few heads turned. More than before. Parker let out a short breath that almost resembled approval. "Yeah," he said, taking half a step closer, peering at the badge now in Reynolds's hand. "That looks official." Another pause. Then almost. The word landed lightly, but the implication didn't. Reynolds turned the badge over between his fingers, examining it like a questionable piece of evidence. "Carter," he read aloud, his voice carrying just enough for others to hear. He glanced back up at her. "No rank insignia," he added. "No unit marking." He tilted his head. "Convenient." Aaliyah's gaze remained steady. "That badge belongs to me," she said. Her tone wasn't raised, wasn't defensive. It was simple, clear, and that more than anything seemed to irritate him. "Does it?" Reynolds replied, a faint smile returning. Because from where I'm standing, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Parker stepped in again this time, closing the space between them more noticeably. He reached out, gripping the fabric of Aaliyah's sleeve briefly, not enough to restrain, but enough to assert control. "Relax," he said quietly. "If everything checks out, you'll get it back." His fingers lingered just a second too long before releasing. Across the room, someone let out a low whistle. "Damn," another voice muttered under their breath. "This is getting interesting." Phones were no longer subtle. At least 3 were visibly raised now. Recording, watching, waiting. Aaliyah noticed. Of course she did. But her focus didn't shift. It stayed on Reynolds, on Parker, on the space between them. Because this wasn't about the room anymore. It was about the line they had just crossed, and how far they were willing to go past it. Reynolds slipped the badge casually into his hand, not returning it, not pocketing it either, just holding it like leverage. "Here's the thing," he said, his voice lowering slightly, forcing attention inward rather than outward. "We've had people walk in here before, claiming all kinds of things." He took a slow step closer. "So until we verify who you are," he gestured vaguely toward the door, "you're not staying on this floor." Aaliyah's eyes didn't leave his. "You're making a mistake," she said. The words were calm, measured. But something in them shifted the air, not enough to stop him, but enough to register. Reynolds exhaled, shaking his head once, as if dismissing the idea before it could take shape. "Yeah," he replied. "I've heard that one before, too." Parker glanced toward the door, then back at her. "Why don't you save yourself the trouble?" He set his tone almost conversational now, and head downstairs before this turns into something it doesn't need to be. Another officer chimed in from behind them. "Or at least wait outside," he added. "Captain briefing starts in a few minutes anyway." That word captain hung briefly in the air, unnoticed by most. But not by Aaliyah. Her eyes flicked just for a fraction of a second toward the clock. 58 a.m. 2 minutes. Still no interruption. Still no announcement. Still no reason for them to stop. Reynolds caught the glance. "Yeah," he said, following her gaze. "You don't want to be in here when that happens." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "New captain's supposed to be strict." A couple of officers smirked. "Good one," muttered. "This place needs it." Parker nodded once. "Yeah, but not like this." He gestured subtly toward Aaliyah. The message was clear. Not her. Not someone like her. Aaliyah let the silence stretch for a moment longer. Then slowly she extended her hand. Not aggressively. Not suddenly. Just enough to make the intention clear. "Give me my badge," she said. The room shifted again, slightly, but noticeably. Reynolds looked at her hand, then back at her face. And for the first time since she walked in, there was a flicker of something else behind his expression. Not doubt, not yet, but awareness. He didn't return it. Instead, he smiled, slow, deliberate, and stepped back half a pace. "Not until we're done here," he said. The words landed heavier than before. Because now, it wasn't about confusion. It wasn't about procedure. It was about control. Across the room, Diaz shifted again, his arms crossing loosely over his chest, his eyes narrowing just slightly. Something about this wasn't sitting right. But he didn't speak. Not yet. Because in a room like this, speaking too early had consequences. And silence had its own kind of weight. Aaliyah lowered her hand. Not defeated, not frustrated, just patient. Her gaze moved once more to the clock. 7:59 a.m. 1 minute. Reynolds followed her eyes again, then smirked, waiting for something he asked. Aaliyah looked back at him, and for the first time, there was the faintest shift in her expression. Not anger, not fear. Something quieter, something sharper. "Yes," she said. The word was soft, but it landed. And for a brief moment, no one laughed. No one spoke. Because something in the way she said it felt different, felt certain, felt final. Across the room, one of the phones adjusted its angle, zooming in slightly, capturing everything. Because whatever was about to happen next wasn't going to stay inside this room. And deep down, whether they realized it or not, they were already too far in. The second hand on the wall clock clicked forward. 8 a.m. No announcement, no interruption, no one coming through the door to correct what had already gone too far. And in that silence, something shifted. Not in Aaliyah, in them. Reynolds exhaled slowly, glancing once toward the hallway, as if expecting someone, anyone, to walk in and validate his authority over the situation. No one did. So he made a decision. "All right," he said, clapping his hands once again, louder this time, reclaiming the room. "We're not running a waiting lounge here." A few officers chuckled. The tension that had briefly flickered into uncertainty snapped back into confidence. Reynolds turned slightly, addressing the room as much as he was addressing her. "Since you're so comfortable standing around," he added, tilting his head toward Aaliyah, "you can start making yourself useful." Parker smirked, immediately catching on. "Yeah," he said, stepping back toward the desk, grabbing an empty coffee mug and holding it up. "Break room's down the hall. We're running low." Another officer raised his own cup. Black, no sugar. More laughter. Someone added, "Make it fast." The tone wasn't joking anymore. It wasn't light. It was layered authority wrapped in mockery, reinforced by numbers. Aaliyah didn't move, didn't reach for the mug, didn't respond. Reynolds watched her for a moment, then let out a quiet breath through his nose. "Problem?" he asked. Her voice, when it came, was calm. "I'm not here to serve coffee." That should have ended it. In a different room, with different people. It might have. But here Reynolds smiled. Slowly, deliberately. "Yeah," he said. "I figured you'd say that." He stepped closer again, just enough to invade her space without making it obvious. "But here's the thing," he continued, lowering his voice just slightly, forcing attention inward again. "When someone walks into my precinct without clearance, without explanation..." He paused. "They don't get to choose what they're here for." The word "my" didn't go unnoticed. Parker leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms, enjoying the rhythm of it now. Or Parker added casually, "You can keep standing there, and we'll just assume you're refusing a direct instruction." A couple of officers exchanged glances. They knew what that implied. Not procedure. Power. Aaliyah's eyes moved between them. Still steady. Still unreadable. "You're making this worse," she said quietly. Reynolds let out a short laugh. "Am I?" He turned slightly, gesturing toward the room. "Looks fine to me." A few voices murmured agreement. Phones were still up, still recording. Because now, this wasn't just an interaction. It was a performance. And everyone had a role. Parker pushed off the desk again, stepping forward with a bit more edge this time. "Look," he said, his tone losing its casual softness. "We've asked you nicely." He didn't wait for a response. He reached out again this time, not for the badge, but for her arm. His fingers closed around her wrist. Firm. Not violent, but unmistakably controlling. "Let's go," he said. The room leaned in. Aaliyah didn't pull away immediately. She didn't react the way most people would. Instead, she looked down briefly at his hand, then back up at his face. "Take your hand off me," she said. No raised voice, no sharp edge, just clarity. Parker held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. Testing. Then slowly he released. But the damage was already done. Because now everyone had seen it. And no one had stopped it. Reynolds watched the exchange, his expression tightening just slightly, not with concern, but with calculation. "Yeah," he said, stepping in, again, reclaiming control of the moment. "We're not doing this back and forth." He gestured toward the door. "Either you walk out on your own." He let the sentence hang. The implication filled in the rest. "Or we help you." Silence. Not complete, but heavier. Because even the ones enjoying the show could feel it now. This wasn't just uncomfortable. It was crossing lines. Diaz shifted again, his jaw tightening. "This isn't necessary," he said quietly. It wasn't loud. It wasn't forceful. But it was the first time someone had pushed back, even slightly. Reynolds didn't turn to him immediately, didn't acknowledge it. Not at first, because acknowledging doubt meant allowing it to grow. Instead, he kept his eyes on Aaliyah, waiting for compliance, for reaction, for anything that would justify what came next. Aaliyah glanced once more at the clock. 8:01 a.m. 1 minute passed. Still no interruption. Still no announcement. But something had changed. Not in the room. In her. It was subtle. Almost invisible. But Diaz saw it. The shift from waiting to deciding. Aaliyah lowered her hands to her sides, her posture adjusting just slightly less passive, more grounded. Then she spoke. "If I walk out that door," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach beyond Reynolds and Parker, "this becomes something you won't be able to control." The words landed. Not loudly, but deeply. Reynolds' expression flickered. Just for a second. Then hardened again. "Yeah," he said. "You keep saying that." He took a step closer. Close enough now that there was no pretense of space. "No one's coming," he added quietly. "No one's stopping this." Across the room, one of the officers adjusted his phone again, zooming in tighter, capturing every word, every movement, because now, this wasn't just about her. It was about what happened next. Parker glanced toward the hallway again, then back at Reynolds. "Just do it," he muttered under his breath. Reynolds gave the smallest nod. Decision made. He reached toward her again, not for the badge this time, for her arm. But before his hand could make contact, the sound came. Sharp, clear, unmistakable. The door at the far end of the bullpen opened, not loudly, but with authority. And just like that, the room changed. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough for a few heads to turn. Enough for a few phones to lower, just slightly. Enough for the moment to fracture. Reynolds froze mid-motion, his hand stopping just inches from her sleeve. Parker straightened instinctively. Diaz turned fully toward the doorway now, because whoever had just walked in hadn't rushed, hadn't hesitated. They had entered like they belonged, and in a room built on assumptions, that alone was enough to shift everything. Aaliyah didn't turn. She didn't need to, because whatever was standing behind them, she had been waiting for it. The room didn't settle after the door opened. It tightened, like something unseen had just stepped into the space, and everyone felt it before they understood it. But Reynolds didn't turn around. Not yet, because turning around would mean acknowledging that something had changed, and he wasn't ready to give up control. Not when he was this far in. "Stay where you are," he said quietly to Aaliyah, his voice dropping into something colder now. Not louder, just sharper. Parker shifted beside him, his posture straightening, but his attention flickered briefly toward the hallway again. "Who is that one officer?" whispered under his breath. No one answered. Because no one knew. Not yet. Aaliyah still hadn't moved, hadn't even glanced toward the door. Her eyes stayed on Reynolds, and that alone made him uneasy. "You hear me?" He pressed his tone, tightening. "I said don't move." Aaliyah blinked once, slow, measured, then calmly. "I'm not the one who needs to move," she said. The words landed differently this time, not like a warning, like a fact. Parker let out a quiet breath, irritation flashing across his face. "Yeah, we're done with that," he muttered, stepping forward again. "You've had your chance." He reached for her wrist again, faster this time, more force behind it. But just as his fingers closed, a voice cut through the room. Clear, controlled, unquestionable. "That won't be necessary." Everything stopped, not gradually, instantly. Parker froze, his hand still hovering inches from Aaliyah's wrist. Reynolds finally turned. Slowly, reluctantly, and for the first time that morning his expression changed. At the far end of the bullpen stood 3 individuals, 2 in dark suits, one in a navy blazer with a city insignia pinned at the collar. Behind them, just inside the doorway, stood a uniformed officer from Internal Affairs, still, observing, watching everything. The air shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for the phones to lower, enough for the laughter to disappear, enough for people to realize this wasn't just another moment. The man in the front, mid-50s, composed, carrying authority without effort, took a step forward. His eyes moved across the room, taking in faces, positions, postures, then stopping on Reynolds. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. The question wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Reynolds straightened instinctively, his posture correcting itself before his mind caught up. "No, sir," he replied quickly. "Just handling a situation." The man's gaze shifted slightly. "To what situation?" he asked. Reynolds hesitated. "Just for a second." Then unauthorized presence on the floor, he said, gesturing vaguely toward Aaliyah without fully turning his back to the newcomers. "We're verifying identity." The words sounded official. Practiced, safe, but something about the tone didn't hold. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes moved past Reynolds, past Parker, and settled on Aaliyah. He held her gaze for a moment, longer than expected. Then something changed, subtle, but unmistakable. Recognition. Parker noticed it first, not because he understood it, but because he felt it. The shift, the drop in temperature, the way the room seemed to lean away from him without moving. Sir Parker added, stepping slightly to the side, trying to reassert control. "We've got this under—" "You don't," the man interrupted. Flat, immediate, final, silence, heavy, absolute. No one laughed now. No one moved, because the tone had changed, and everyone felt it. The man took another step forward, his gaze never leaving Aaliyah. "Officer," he said, not to Reynolds, not to Parker, to her. "Are you all right?" The question hung in the air, not because it was dramatic, but because of what it implied. Aaliyah nodded once. "I'm fine," she replied. Calm, controlled, unshaken. Reynolds' jaw tightened slightly. Something wasn't adding up. Not yet, but enough to make him uncomfortable. "Sir," he said, stepping forward just a fraction. "With all due respect, we were following protocol," the man repeated, turning his head just enough to look at him. And in that look there was no confusion, only evaluation. "Is that what you call it?" he asked. Reynolds didn't answer immediately, because now the room was no longer his. The man's gaze moved again, this time to Parker, then briefly to Diaz, then across the rest of the bullpen. Noting, cataloging, remembering. Finally, he turned back to Aaliyah, and this time he spoke her name. "Captain Carter," he said. The world didn't explode. There was no dramatic sound, no visible shockwave, but the effect was immediate. Reynolds froze, completely, like his body had stopped receiving instructions. Parker's face drained of color. Gone. In seconds. One of the officers near the back dropped his phone. It hit the floor with a dull, hollow sound that echoed louder than it should have. Diaz closed his eyes briefly. Just for a second. Because now it made sense. Everything. The silence. The composure. The waiting. Aaliyah reached up calmly and extended her hand toward Reynolds. Not aggressively, not triumphantly, just expectantly. "My badge," she said. No one laughed. No one whispered. No one moved. Because the line had already been crossed, and there was no stepping back. Reynolds looked at the badge in his hand, then at her, then at the man behind her. His fingers trembled. Slightly. But enough. The room watched. Because this was the moment everything shifted. And whatever came next would define everything that came after no one spoke. Not because they didn't have something to say, but because nothing they could say would fix what had just happened. Reynolds stood there, the badge still in his hand, as if returning it now would somehow undo the last 10 minutes. It wouldn't, and deep down, he knew it. Aaliyah didn't move her hand. She didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. "My badge." The words still hung in the air, steady, unshaken. Reynolds swallowed. Hard. Then slowly, too slowly, he extended his hand forward. The badge rested in his palm for a moment longer than necessary before Aaliyah took it back. Her fingers closed around it with quiet precision. No anger. No rush. Just control. The kind that didn't need to prove itself. She clipped it back onto her uniform, smoothing the fabric once, as if resetting the moment, not erasing it, but placing it exactly where it belonged. Then she looked at him. Not with triumph, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. From this point forward, she said, her voice calm, "But carrying you will address me correctly." The words didn't echo. They settled. Heavy. Unavoidable. Reynolds opened his mouth, then stopped. Because for the first time that morning, he didn't know what to say. Parker shifted beside him, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer confident. His hands hovered awkwardly at his sides, unsure where to go, what to do, how to exist in this new reality. Across the room, no one lifted a phone, no one whispered, no one laughed. Because the performance was over. And now this was real. The man from the doorway stepped forward again, his presence anchoring the room. "I suggest everyone here take a moment," he said evenly, "to consider what just occurred." His eyes moved across the bullpen again. Slower this time. Intentional. Because this is no longer an internal misunderstanding. The words landed like weight, not loud, but undeniable. Reynolds straightened instinctively, trying to recover some fragment of control. "Sir," he said, forcing his voice steady, "if there's been a miscommunication, we can clarify." "This wasn't miscommunication," the man interrupted. Not sharply, but definitively. This was conduct. Silence again. Deeper now. Reynolds' jaw tightened, his hands now empty flexed once at his sides. Because he felt it, the shift. The loss. The reality settling in. Aaliyah stepped forward. Not quickly. Not aggressively. But with purpose. And as she moved, the room adjusted. Subtly. Instinctively. People stepped back without realizing they were doing it. Space opened. Respect, late forced, but undeniable, began to take shape. She stopped at the center of the bullpen, the same spot where she had stood moments earlier, being laughed at. Now no one met her eyes casually. "Let's be clear," she said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Every action taken here this morning," she let her gaze move across the room, "was observed." A few officers shifted. Uncomfortable. Because they knew. They had seen the phones. They had heard the comments. They had participated. Or worse, they had done nothing. Aaliyah continued. Every word she added. Every assumption. Every decision. Her eyes landed briefly on Parker, then on Reynolds, and stayed there. Reynolds felt it. That look, not angry, not emotional, precise, measured, final. "Sir," Parker said suddenly, his voice tighter, now directed toward the man from the doorway. "We didn't have confirmation of her identity. We followed standard. You escalated without verification," the man replied. "Immediate. Cold. You applied authority where none was warranted." Parker's mouth opened again, then closed. Because there was no argument left, that didn't make things worse. Diaz stepped forward slightly now. Not enough to draw attention, but enough to be seen. "Captain," he said quietly. Aaliyah turned her head just enough to acknowledge him. "Go ahead," she said. Diaz exhaled once, measured. "I should have intervened sooner," he said. The admission landed differently than anything else that had been said. Because it was real. Because it wasn't defensive. Aaliyah held his gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Noted," she said. "No praise, no dismissal, just acknowledgement." Reynolds watched the exchange, something tightening in his chest. Because even that small moment was something he no longer controlled. The man from the doorway stepped closer again, now standing just behind Aaliyah's shoulder. "Internal Affairs has been monitoring multiple precincts," he said, addressing the room. "Patterns." The word echoed. Not literally, but in meaning. Patterns of behavior. Patterns of assumption. Patterns of power. Today, he continued, was not random. A shift moved through the room again. Because now this wasn't just about one incident. It was about something bigger. Something ongoing. Aaliyah spoke again. "This was a test," she said. The words were simple, but they changed everything. Reynolds blinked, once, then again. Because now it wasn't just a mistake. It was a failure. Documented, deliberate, irreversible. "You were given an opportunity," Aaliyah continued, her voice steady, unwavering, "to demonstrate professionalism, restraint, judgment." She paused. "Let the silence hold. And you chose otherwise." No one argued. No one denied it. Because they couldn't. The evidence wasn't just in reports. It was in memory. in recordings, in witnesses. Parker took a step back. Just one. But it was enough. Enough to show the shift. Enough to show the realization setting in. Reynolds didn't move, but his hands, they trembled, slightly, barely visible, but real. Aaliyah turned slightly, addressing the man behind her. "Proceed," she said. One word. Clear. Decisive. And with it, the moment ended. And the consequences began. The internal affairs officer stepped forward. Not hurried, not aggressive, just inevitable. A clipboard in hand. A list already prepared. Names, positions, actions. The room watched. Because now this wasn't about what had happened. It was about what came next. And no one, not Reynolds. Not Parker. Not anyone in that room could stop it. The shift didn't happen with a bang. It happened in silence. Heavy. Suffocating. Absolute. The kind of silence that forces people to hear their own thoughts, whether they want to or not. The internal affairs officer stepped fully into the bullpen, now the soft echo of his shoes against the floor sounding louder than it should have. In his hand was a thin folder, unremarkable in appearance, but suddenly the most important object in the room. Because inside it were consequences. He stopped just beside Aaliyah, not in front of her, not above her, but aligned, respectfully, deliberately. The positioning didn't go unnoticed. Reynolds saw it. Parker saw it. Everyone saw it. And in that small detail, the hierarchy became undeniable. The man in the navy blazer spoke again, his voice calm, but now carrying something sharper beneath it. "For the record," he said, glancing briefly at the internal affairs officer, then back at the room, "this interaction has been documented in full." A ripple moved through the bullpen. Not loud, but real, because now there was no version of events to control, no narrative to reshape, no room for reinterpretation, only fact. Reynolds shifted his weight, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer certain. "Sir," he said, trying again, forcing steadiness into his voice, "with all due respect, we were operating based on available information." "You were operating on assumption," the man corrected. "Flat, unemotional. And assumption," he added, letting the word settle, "is not a substitute for procedure." Reynolds didn't respond. Because he couldn't. Not without making it worse. Parker ran a hand briefly across the back of his neck, his gaze dropping for the first time that morning. Across the room, the phones that had once been raised high were now lowered completely. Some had been slipped quietly into pockets. Others sat face down on desks. Because what had felt like entertainment moments ago now felt like evidence. Diaz stood still, his arms no longer crossed, his posture more open, but his expression tight. Focused. Watching. Because this wasn't over. Not yet, not even close. Aaliyah stepped forward again. Not to dominate, not to intimidate, but to take her place. The center of the room adjusted around her instinctively. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice steady, carrying just enough to reach every corner of the bullpen. "I want clarity." Her gaze moved across the officers. One by one. Deliberate. Intentional. Every individual involved, she continued, will be given an opportunity to account for their actions. A pause. Short. Controlled. "But understand this," she added, her tone sharpening just slightly. "This is not a discussion. It is a record." The words landed. Harder than anything before, because now there was no escape through explanation, only acknowledgement. The internal affairs officer opened the folder. Slowly, methodically. The sound of paper shifting seemed amplified in the silence. Officer Daniel Reynolds, he read. The name cut through the room. Reynolds straightened instinctively. Not out of confidence. Out of reflex. "Yes, sir," he said. "Step forward." Reynolds hesitated. Just for a fraction of a second. Then moved. One step. Then another. Each one heavier than the last. He stopped a few feet in front of Aaliyah. Close enough to speak. Too close to hide. The internal affairs officer didn't look at him immediately. Instead, he scanned the document in front of him. Multiple instances of unverified authority assertion, he read. Physical interference with official identification. A slight pause. Public misconduct. The words didn't need volume. They carried weight on their own. Reynolds's jaw tightened. "That's not," he started, then stopped. Because the man in the blazer didn't even look at him. He didn't need to. The silence itself was the correction. Aaliyah's gaze remained steady, unmoved, uninterrupted. "Do you dispute any of these observations?" the internal affairs officer asked. Reynolds exhaled slowly. His eyes flicked just once toward the room behind him, toward the officers who had laughed, who had watched, who had done nothing. No one met his gaze. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Because now, it was individual. And everyone understood that. Reynolds looked back at the officer. "No," he said. The word came out quieter than expected, almost swallowed. But it was enough. The internal affairs officer made a note. Quick, efficient, permanent. "Step back," he said. Reynolds didn't move immediately, because stepping back meant accepting it, fully. But after a moment he did, and the room felt it. That shift, that fall. Next, Officer Mark Parker. Parker froze for half a second, then stepped forward. Faster than Reynolds had. Like movement might somehow lessen the weight. It didn't. The same process, the same tone, the same silence. Unwarranted physical contact, the officer read. Failure to verify identity. Participation in public misconduct. Parker swallowed. Hard. "We didn't know," he started. "You didn't check," the officer replied. Immediate, unyielding. Silence again. Parker's shoulders dropped slightly, not visibly enough to draw attention. But enough. "Do you dispute the record?" the officer asked. Parker shook his head. Once. No words. None needed. Step back, he did. Faster, this time. Because now he understood. Across the room, one by one, names began to follow. Some stepped forward reluctantly, some immediately, some barely able to speak, others choosing silence. But the pattern remained the same. Observation. Acknowledgement. Record. And through it all, Aaliyah stood at the center, not reacting, not interrupting, not escalating, just present. Because this moment wasn't about anger. It was about truth, and truth didn't need to raise its voice. As the last name was called, the internal affairs officer closed the folder. The sound echoed softly. Final. But not complete. Because there was still one thing left. One question that hadn't been asked. The man in the blazer stepped forward again. His gaze moved across the room, then settled once more on Aaliyah. "Captain Carter," he said. The title carried differently now. Not shocking, not surprising, established. "Would you like to proceed with formal action at this time?" he asked. "Or address the unit first?" The room held its breath. Not literally, but close enough. Because this was the moment before everything truly shifted. Not just for Reynolds, not just for Parker, but for everyone in that room. Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. She looked around. Slowly, taking in every face, every posture, every trace of what had happened just minutes ago. And then she spoke, but not the way they expected. Before anything else, she said, her voice calm, but carrying something deeper. Now there's something you all need to understand. A pause. Longer this time. Intentional. Because what she was about to say would define everything that came next. And somewhere in the room, someone realized the real shift hadn't even happened yet. No one expected it to land like that. Not the title, not the silence, not the weight of a single word spoken at the exact wrong moment for the wrong people. Captain? It didn't echo. It didn't need to. It dropped into the room like something solid, something irreversible. And everything cracked around it. Reynolds didn't move at first. He didn't blink, didn't breathe. Because his brain hadn't caught up yet. Because just seconds ago she was nothing. Just another face, another body in the wrong place, another person he could control. And now his hands were still remembering the feel of her badge in his grip. Parker stepped back instinctively. Not a full step. Just enough to break proximity. Enough to create distance. Like distance could undo contact. Like stepping away could erase what had already happened. It couldn't. Across the room, the officers who had been laughing weren't laughing anymore. Phones lowered. Slowly. Quietly. One slipped from someone's hand and hit the floor with a dull sound that no one reacted to. Because no one could look away. Because every eye was on her. Aaliyah didn't rush, didn't react to the shock, didn't acknowledge the tension snapping tight across the room. She simply lifted her hand again. Calm, controlled, waiting. My badge, same tone, same volume, but now no one mistook it for a request. Reynolds looked down at it, still in his hand, still between his fingers. Like evidence, like guilt. His grip loosened, just slightly, then tightened again, because something inside him was still trying desperately to hold on to control. This, he started, his voice catching just enough to betray him. This wasn't give it back. Aaliyah didn't raise her voice, didn't interrupt. She replaced him. The authority in her words didn't push. It settled. Heavy. Final. Reynolds swallowed. Hard. Then slowly, like every movement had to be forced through resistance, he extended his hand. The badge rested in his palm, for a second too long, a second that felt like it stretched across the entire room. And then she took it. Clean. Precise. Like it had never left her. She clipped it back onto her uniform, without looking down. Without hesitation. Without ceremony. Just restored. And that simple motion said more than anything else, because now there was no doubt, no confusion, no interpretation left. She looked at him. Not angry, not emotional, just clear. You don't touch a superior officer, she said. Quiet, sharp, unarguable. Reynolds's face went pale. Not dramatically, but visibly. Enough. His lips parted slightly, then closed, because there was nothing left to say that wouldn't make it worse. Behind her, the man in the blazer stepped forward again, his voice cutting cleanly into the silence. Let's make something very clear, he said. The tone had changed. No longer observational. Now official. Captain Aaliyah Carter was assigned to take command of this precinct as of 0800 hours. The words hit like a shockwave, because now there was a timestamp, a line, A moment where everything became undeniable. Reynolds' eyes flicked to the clock. 8:04 a.m. 4 minutes. 4 minutes into her command, and he had already crossed every line possible. Parker shook his head slightly, almost unconsciously, like his body was rejecting reality before his mind could accept it. "No," he muttered under his breath. "That's not... It is." The internal affairs officer spoke this time, flat, final. And suddenly there were no more voices, only consequences. Aaliyah stepped forward, not aggressively, but decisively, and the room moved around her. People shifted, cleared space, lowered their gaze. Because instinct, the same instinct that had dismissed her minutes ago, now corrected itself. Too late. "You said something earlier," she said, her eyes returning to Reynolds. He didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because he remembered. "You don't belong here." She repeated it exactly. No exaggeration. No added emotion. Just truth. And that made it worse. Because everyone had heard it. Everyone remembered it. Reynolds' hands trembled. Just slightly. But enough. He tried again, but the words didn't come. Because now they sounded different in his head, different in this room, different when spoken to the person they were never supposed to be said to. Aaliyah didn't wait, didn't give him space to recover. "You were right," she said. That made him look up. Hope, brief, desperate, flashed across his face. Then died. "Not everyone belongs in a position of authority," she continued. Her voice remained calm, controlled, but every word landed with precision. And this morning... A pause. Short. Deadly. "You proved exactly why." The room went still. Completely. No shifting. No whispering. No movement. Because now this wasn't a twist anymore. This was judgment. And it had already been made. Across the bullpen, Diaz exhaled slowly. Because he understood something the others were only just beginning to grasp. This moment wasn't about revealing who she was. It was about revealing who they were. And that was far worse. Aaliyah turned slightly, her gaze moving across the room again, taking it all in. Every face, every reaction, every trace of what had just unfolded. This wasn't a misunderstanding, she said. It was a demonstration. The word settled heavily, because now there was no escaping it, no reframing it, no softening it. Everything they had done had been seen, measured, recorded, and now it would be answered. She stepped back. One small movement, but it shifted the energy again, because now it wasn't about her speaking. It was about what came next. And behind her, internal affairs was already moving. No one reached for their phones anymore. Not because they were told to stop, but because suddenly recording this didn't feel like entertainment. It felt like evidence against themselves. The air inside the bullpen had changed. Not tense, not chaotic. Heavy. Like the room itself was holding on to everything that had just happened, refusing to let anyone pretend it didn't. Aaliyah Carter stood at the center of it, completely still. Her badge, now clipped back in place, caught the light again. But this time, no one questioned it. No one looked at it twice, because now they understood exactly what it meant. The internal affairs officer stepped forward, flipping open the folder with deliberate precision. The soft rustle of paper sounded louder than it should have, because it wasn't just paper. It was record. And record didn't forget. This interaction, he began, his voice calm and exact, has been documented in full through both internal observation and third-party recording. A subtle shift moved across the room. Eyes dropped. Postures tightened, because everyone knew some of those recordings came from them. You were not interrupted, he continued. You were not provoked. He paused. You were observed. The word landed deeper than accusation, because it removed every excuse. Reynolds felt it hit, hard. His jaw clenched, but he didn't speak, because arguing now would only confirm it. The officer turned a page. 0747 hours, he read. Subject enters the bullpen. No obstruction. No restriction. Another page. 0752 verbal assumptions initiated. The words weren't emotional. They weren't charged. But each one carried weight. Because each one matched memory, matched action, matched reality. 0755, physical interference with identification. Parker's shoulders dropped slightly. Just enough. 0758, attempted removal from secured floor without verification. Silence. Deeper now. More personal. Because this wasn't general anymore. It was exact. Precise. Undeniable. Aaliyah didn't move, didn't react. She didn't need to. Because the truth was speaking for her. The internal affairs officer looked up from the folder. His gaze swept across the room. Let's be clear, he said. And now his tone changed. Not louder, sharper. This was not confusion. A pause. This was behavior. Reynolds felt something drop in his chest. Because that word behavior didn't leave room for interpretation, didn't allow for defense, didn't soften anything. It defined it. The officer stepped forward. One step. Enough to close the distance between documentation and consequence. Officer Reynolds, he said. Reynolds didn't hesitate this time. He stepped forward, but the difference was unmistakable. Minutes ago, he had moved like he owned the room. Now he moved like the room had turned on him. You removed official identification, the officer continued, his eyes steady, his voice unwavering. You asserted authority without verification. You escalated the situation in a public setting. Each statement hit, one after another, measured, final. Reynolds exhaled slowly. That wasn't, he started, then stopped. Because even he heard it. The weakness in it. The lack of ground beneath it. The officer didn't interrupt. He didn't need to, because silence was enough to shut it down. Do you deny these actions? He asked. Reynolds looked around. At Parker. At the others. At the room that had laughed with him minutes ago. No one stepped forward. No one spoke. Because now it wasn't collective anymore. It was individual. And no one was willing to carry it with him. Reynolds looked back. No, he said. The word came out quieter than expected, but it landed. Permanent. The officer made a note. Quick. Precise. Then Officer Parker. Parker stepped forward. Faster. More controlled. But his hands, they betrayed him. Slight tension. Slight tremor. You initiated physical contact without cause, the officer read. You participated in the escalation of an unverified situation. You reinforced assumption as authority. Parker swallowed. Hard. We were trying to... He started. You didn't verify, the officer cut in. Flat. Immediate. And verification, he added, is not optional. Parker's mouth closed, because there was no response to that. None that didn't make it worse. Do you deny it? The officer asked. Parker shook his head. Once. No words. Because words wouldn't help. Not here. Not anymore. Step back. He did, immediately. Because now he understood something Reynolds hadn't yet fully accepted. This wasn't about explaining. It was about recording. Across the room, the process continued. Names called, actions stated, responses given or not given, each one adding to the same conclusion. This wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern. And now it had been exposed. Fully. When the final name was read, the officer closed the folder. The sound was soft, but final, like a door shutting. Aaliyah stepped forward, again, and once more the room adjusted around her, not out of fear, out of recognition. This was not about rank, she said. Her voice was calm. But it carried something deeper now. Something rooted. This was about how you chose to act, when you believed no one was watching. The words settled slowly, because now everyone understood. That had been the test. Not who she was, but who they were. You weren't tested on knowledge, she continued. You were tested on judgment. A pause. And judgment, she added, is what defines authority. Reynolds looked up. Finally, because now he saw it. Not the mistake, the meaning behind it. Too late. Aaliyah held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Because this part, this realization was his to carry, not hers to explain. Behind her, internal affairs stood ready, not waiting, not hesitating, just prepared, because everything had already been decided. The only thing left was to act on it. The room didn't explode into chaos. It collapsed into order, cold, precise, unforgiving, because once authority shifted, everything that followed became inevitable. The internal affairs officer didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped forward and began speaking like a man reading something already decided long before anyone in that room realized they were being watched. Officer Daniel Reynolds. No hesitation this time. Reynolds stepped forward immediately, but the difference was unmistakable. Minutes ago, he moved like he owned the room. Now, he moved like he was being removed from it. Effective immediately, the officer said, eyes steady, tone exact. You are suspended pending formal investigation for conduct violations, including abuse of authority, failure to verify identity, and unauthorized physical interference. Each charge landed clean, sharp, final. Reynolds didn't argue, didn't react. Not outwardly, but his breathing changed. Subtle, uneven, because now it was real. You will surrender your badge and service weapon, the officer continued. All system access is revoked as of this moment. Reynolds's fingers hovered near his badge. Just for a second. Like muscle memory hadn't caught up yet. Then slowly he unclipped it. The same badge he had taken from her. The same badge he had held like it meant nothing. Now it felt like everything. He placed it into the officer's hand. Carefully, almost respectfully. Because now respect wasn't a choice. It was the only thing left. His weapon followed, removed, secured, transferred without resistance. And just like that, the man who had controlled the room minutes ago was no longer part of it. Step aside, the officer said. Reynolds did. Immediately. No delay. No resistance. Because there was nothing left to hold on to. Officer Mark Parker. Parker stepped forward faster. Too fast. Like compliance might still earn him something. It didn't. Administrative leave, the officer stated. Pending review for misconduct, including unwarranted physical contact and escalation without verification. Parker nodded. Short. Tight. Controlled. But his eyes betrayed him. They flicked once, just once, toward Aaliyah. Not angry, not defensive, just aware. Aware of what he had done. aware of who he had done it to. Too late. Badge, weapon. No hesitation this time. Parker removed both, passed them forward, hands steady, but only just. Because inside, everything had shifted. Around them, the room stayed silent. Not because they were told to be, because they understood. One by one, the remaining officers who had participated were called. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same tone, the same structure, the same certainty. Some stepped forward with visible tension, some with quiet resignation. One hesitated long enough for the internal affairs officer to repeat his name. That hesitation alone said everything, because now even silence had consequences. Aaliyah didn't interrupt, didn't step in, didn't add to the process. She stood at the center, watching. Not as someone seeking control, but as someone restoring it. And that difference was undeniable. When the final badge was collected, the officer closed the folder. Soft, precise, final. And that sound marked the end of something. Not just for Reynolds, not just for Parker, but for the way that room had functioned before she walked in. The man in the navy blazer stepped forward again. For the record, he said, his voice calm, but carrying this action is immediate and non-negotiable. No one reacted, because there was nothing left to react to. This precinct will undergo full operational review, he continued. Oversight protocols will be enforced at every level. A shift moved through the remaining officers. Subtle, but real. Because now, this wasn't temporary. It wasn't contained. It was structural. Permanent. Aaliyah stepped forward. And this time, no one hesitated. The room adjusted instantly. Naturally. Instinctively. "This is what accountability looks like," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Because now everyone was listening. "Not when it's convenient," she continued. "Not when it's expected." A pause. Short, sharp, but when it's necessary. Her gaze moved across the room, taking in every face that remained, every officer who had watched, who had stayed silent, who had allowed it. "You don't get to choose when the standard applies," she said. The words landed heavier than anything before, because now they weren't about punishment, they were about expectation. "And you don't get to ignore it," she added. Across the room, a young officer swallowed hard, because now he understood something he hadn't before. This wasn't about one mistake, it was about a system. And systems only change when someone forces them to. Aaliyah turned slightly. Not toward Reynolds. Not toward Parker. Toward the door. Because that was where this part ended. Reynolds stood near the edge now, waiting. Because he knew. There was no speech, no defense, no final moment of control. Just exit. He took a step, then another. Each one slower than the last. Because now every eye followed him, not with respect, not with fear, with memory. Parker followed behind him, silent, shoulders tight, head slightly lowered. The door opened. Light from the hallway cut briefly across the room. Then they stepped through. The door closed. And just like that, they were gone. No applause. No reaction. Just absence. The room remained still. Not frozen, not broken. Reset. Aaliyah stood there for a moment longer. Taking it in. Not the fall. Not the silence. The shift. Because that was the real outcome. And that was what would last. The silence didn't linger this time. It settled. And then it started to change shape. Because something inside the room had shifted, not just authority, not just control awareness. And awareness doesn't stay still. It moves. Slow at first. Then all at once. Aaliyah Carter stood where everything had unfolded, her posture steady, her presence no longer questioned, only measured. But what mattered now was not what she had revealed. It was what they would do with it. No one rushed back to their desks. No one tried to act like nothing had happened, because no one believed that anymore. The bullpen felt different, quieter. Not empty, just honest. Diaz was the first to break from stillness. Not dramatically, not to draw attention. He stepped forward, stopping at a respectful distance. "Captain." His voice carried clearly. Not loud, not uncertain. Just grounded. Aaliyah turned slightly. "Go ahead." Diaz held her gaze. "I saw it happening," he said. "And I didn't step in when I should have. No hesitation. No justification. Just truth." And that made the room listen again, because truth spoken without defense always lands differently. Aaliyah studied him for a moment, long enough to understand the weight behind the words. Then she nodded. "You noticed," she said. A pause. But noticing isn't action. Diaz didn't argue, didn't look away, because he knew. "I understand," he replied. And for the first time, his posture shifted. Not defensive, not uncertain. Resolved. Behind him, movement followed. Not forced, not directed. A younger officer stepped forward next, his expression tight, his voice less controlled. "Captain, I didn't say anything either." He swallowed. Hard. "I thought it wasn't my place." The admission hung in the air. Because it was familiar. Too familiar. Aaliyah looked at him. Really looked. "You thought silence protected you," she said. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." She let that sit for a moment. "Then silence protects behavior," she said. The words landed heavier than anything before, because now they weren't about one moment. They were about all the moments before it, and all the ones that could come after. Across the room, a few officers shifted. Subtle, but real, because they saw themselves in that statement, more than they wanted to. Aaliyah took a step forward, and this time no one hesitated, no one questioned. The room aligned around her. Naturally. "You don't build a department on rank," she said. Her voice was calm, even, but carried deeper now. "You build it on standard." She let her eyes move across the room. Every face, every reaction, every trace of what had just happened. And a standard, she continued, only means something when it's upheld, even when it's uncomfortable. No one spoke, because now they understood the difference between policy and practice, between knowing and doing. The man in the blazer remained near the back, watching quietly, no longer intervening, because this was leadership taking hold, and it didn't need reinforcement. Aaliyah turned, slightly glancing toward the hallway beyond the glass. Movement was already there. Officers passing by, slower than usual. Looking in. Word had spread, not through reports, through impact, because something like this doesn't stay contained. It travels, through conversations, through silence, through the way people look at each other afterward. "By the end of today," she said, turning back to the room, "everyone in this building will know what happened here. No threat, no exaggeration. just fact, and what they take from it. A pause. Depends on what you do next. That was the shift. Not punishment. Expectation. Because consequences end, but expectation continues. Diaz nodded slightly. Others followed. Not all at once, but enough. Enough to show something had changed. Aaliyah stepped back half a pace. Not retreating. Resetting. From this moment forward, she said, you verify before you act. Simple. Clear. Non-negotiable. You question behavior, not identity. Another pause. And you correct each other. Before someone else has to. The words moved through the room. Not like orders. Like structure. Like something that could actually hold. The younger officer straightened his shoulders. More grounded now. Less uncertain. Because now he had direction. Not just instruction. Aaliyah looked around one last time. And what she saw was different. Not perfect, not fixed, but aware. And awareness was where change began. Briefing starts in 10 minutes, she said. Back to routine. But not the same routine. Be ready. Officers began to move. Not rushed, not scattered. Purposeful. Because now they weren't just showing up. They were being measured. Not by her alone. By themselves. Aaliyah remained where she was for a moment longer. Watching. Not the movement. The shift beneath it. Because that was what mattered. That was what would last. And for the first time that morning, the room didn't feel like a place of control. It felt like a place that might finally learn. By noon, the story had already moved beyond the bullpen. Not through an official memo, not through a press release, through people, through tone, through the way officers spoke more carefully in the hallway, the way conversations paused when someone walked by, the way eyes lingered just a second longer than usual, because something had changed, and no one could pretend they didn't feel it. Inside a smaller conference room overlooking the precinct floor, Captain Aaliyah Carter stood at the head of a long table. The blinds were half open, letting in thin strips of midday light that cut across stacks of files, printed reports, and a tablet displaying recorded footage from earlier that morning. Not all of it. Just enough. Enough to remind. Enough to anchor the process, in fact. Around the table sat a smaller group, internal affairs, a city compliance officer, and 2 senior supervisors who had not been present during the incident. No one spoke casually here. No one shifted unnecessarily. Because this room was where outcome became structure. Let's begin with confirmed findings, the internal affairs officer said, opening his folder again. Aaliyah didn't sit. She remained standing, listening, observing, because even now, she was measuring more than just the content. She was measuring tone. Language, responsibility, multiple violations of procedural protocol, the officer continued, failure to verify identity, misuse of authority, and escalation without cause. The compliance officer nodded slightly, making notes. Any prior indicators, she asked. The officer flipped a page. Yes. 3 internal complaints within the last year referencing similar behavior patterns. None escalated beyond preliminary review. A brief silence followed. Because now the problem had a history. And history meant responsibility extended beyond individuals. Aaliyah spoke. Those complaints, she said, her voice calm but direct, were closed without corrective action. The officer met her gaze. Yes. Aaliyah nodded once. Not surprised, but not dismissing it either. That changes now, she said. Simple. Final. No one questioned it, because no one in that room doubted her authority anymore. The compliance officer leaned forward slightly. What are your recommendations? Captain Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. She glanced once at the tablet paused on a still frame of the morning incident. Reynolds' hand mid-motion, Parker's posture leaning forward, phones raised in the background. Then she looked back at the table. Immediate retraining, she said. Mandatory, not optional. She placed one hand lightly on the table. Bias recognition, de-escalation, procedural verification. Each word landed with precision. And supervision accountability, she added. Failure to intervene will be treated as participation. That shifted the room. Not dramatically, but enough. Because now silence had officially become action. The compliance officer wrote quickly. And disciplinary follow-through, she asked. Aaliyah's gaze didn't waver. Consistent, she said. A pause. Documented. And visible. Not for punishment. For standard. The internal affairs officer nodded. That can be implemented immediately. Aaliyah inclined her head slightly. Good. She stepped back from the table. Then we move forward. No long speech, no extended explanation. Because everything that needed to be said already had been. Back in the bullpen, the atmosphere had shifted again. Not tense, not quiet. Focused. Officers sat at their desks reviewing reports with more attention than before. Conversations were shorter, clearer, more deliberate. Diaz stood near the central board reviewing assignments for the afternoon shift. He paused briefly, glancing toward the doorway of the conference room, then back to the board. Because now he understood his role differently, not just as an officer, as a standard holder. The young officer from earlier approached him. "Sergeant," he said quietly. Diaz turned. "Yes." The officer hesitated. "Then I won't stay silent again." Diaz studied him for a moment, then nodded once. "Make sure you don't," he said. "No lecture, no praise, just expectation." And that was enough. When Aaliyah stepped back into the bullpen, the shift was immediate, not forced, not exaggerated, natural. Officers straightened slightly, not stiff, not nervous, aware. She walked through the space without stopping, her eyes moving across desks, screens, faces, not searching for mistakes, observing behavior. And what she saw was different. Small changes, subtle corrections, but real. She stopped near the center, not to address them, just to stand, to be present. Because presence, when it's real, does more than words ever could. The room continued working. No one froze. No one performed. They simply adjusted. And that was the beginning of something lasting. Aaliyah turned slightly, her gaze catching the reflection in the glass, her uniform, her badge, the room behind her. This time, everything aligned. No tension, no question, just clarity. "Captain." She turned. Diaz stood a few steps away. "Assignments are updated," he said. "Afternoon shift is ready." Aaliyah nodded. "Good." A pause. "Then keep it that way." He held her gaze. "I will." No hesitation. No doubt. Because now he meant it, and she knew. Aaliyah looked around one last time, not at what had been lost, at what had been reset. Because justice wasn't just removing what was wrong. It was building what came next. And for the first time that day, that part had begun. The precinct didn't feel new. It felt corrected. Not cleaner, not quieter, but aligned in a way it hadn't been before. By late afternoon, the light coming through the high windows had softened, casting long shadows across the bullpen. The same desks were there, the same walls, the same people, But the atmosphere it held something different now. Something earned. Captain Aaliyah Carter stood near the front of the room, reviewing a final report. Her posture remained composed, her movements efficient, her expression calm. No one questioned her presence anymore. No one second-guessed her authority, because now it had nothing to do with her title. It had everything to do with what she had done with it. Across the room, officers moved through their duties with quiet focus. Conversations were shorter, more precise. Instructions were followed without the need for repetition. Not out of fear, out of understanding. Diaz stood near the board again, organizing the final shift assignments. He glanced toward Aaliyah briefly, then back to his work. There was no hesitation in his movements now. No uncertainty, because something inside him had settled. The younger officer from earlier walked past, pausing just slightly as he passed Aaliyah. Captain? Simple. Respectful. Real. Aaliyah acknowledged him with a small nod. Nothing more. Because that was enough. Respect didn't need to be announced. It showed itself. The room continued moving. Steady. Controlled. Different. Aaliyah closed the report in her hand and set it down on the desk. The sound was soft, but final. Because this part of the day, this part of the process was complete. She stepped forward, moving toward the center of the bullpen, and without being asked, the room responded. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. Conversations slowed. Movements paused. Attention shifted, until silence settled. Not forced, not commanded. Chosen. Aaliyah looked around, taking in every face, every posture, every trace of what had been, and what now stood in its place. She didn't speak immediately, because she didn't need to fill the space. She let them feel it. The difference, the weight of it, the meaning of it. Then she spoke. Today wasn't about exposure. Her voice was calm. Even. But carried across the room with quiet authority. It was about clarity. A pause. No one moved, because now they understood the difference. You weren't tested on policy, she continued. You were tested on judgment. Her eyes moved slowly across the officers. One moment, she said. One decision. Another pause. That's all it takes. The words settled deeply, because now they weren't theoretical. They had lived through it, seen it, felt it. The uniform you wear, she said, her gaze steady, doesn't protect you from accountability. A slight shift in tone. Not louder, sharper. It places you inside it. No one looked away, because no one could. And the moment you forget that, a pause, you lose the right to wear it. Silence. Complete. Unbroken. Because that was the truth. And truth didn't need emphasis. It needed recognition. Aaliyah let the words settle, then took a slow breath. Not to steady herself, but to mark the end. This precinct doesn't need perfection, she said. The tone softened slightly. Not weaker, just grounded. It needs consistency. Her eyes moved again. More slowly now. And consistency, she added, comes from what you do when no one corrects you. The room held that, because now they knew exactly what she meant. They had been there. In that moment. When no one stepped in. When no one corrected. When behavior revealed itself. And now that moment would never feel the same again. Aaliyah stepped back slightly, not retreating, releasing the space. Dismissed. Simple, clear, final. The word moved through the room like a quiet reset. Officers began to move again. Not rushed, not chaotic, purposeful. Because now they weren't just returning to work. They were carrying something with them, something that would follow them beyond this room, beyond this day. Diaz watched them go, then looked back at Aaliyah. No words. None needed. Because everything that needed to be understood already was. Aaliyah remained where she was for a moment longer. Alone now, the room slowly emptying around her. She glanced down briefly at her badge. The same badge, the same symbol. But it felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter. Clearer. Because it wasn't about what it represented. It was about what it demanded. She looked up again. At the room. At the space that had changed. At the system that had shifted. And for the first time that day, there was no tension in it. Just direction. Just purpose. Just forward. Respect isn't requested, she said quietly to herself. A pause. Then, it's revealed. And with that she turned and walked forward. Not into control, into responsibility. And this time nothing stood in her way.